Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's Fiber Broadband Association webinar titled Automating to Win, How Telcos Are Using Automation to Win and Keep Subscribers. My name is Doug Weinbaum, and I'm the Senior Operations Coordinator for FBA. Joining us today, we have Pete Pizzatillo, Vice President, ETI Software, and Guy Bavente, founder of BevTech. I'm going to quickly go over a few logistical items before we get started. Please keep in mind all participants are in listen mode only. To ask a question during the presentation, please type them into the question box located within your control panel. We'll host a Q&A session towards the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Webinars drop-down option. In your handout section of your control panel, you will find a PDF of the presentation slides and a handout titled The Case for Automation. And lastly, at the conclusion of the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief feedback survey. We appreciate your input. So now pass it over to Pete to begin today's presentation.
Great, thanks, Doug. Hello, everybody. My name is Pete Pizzatillo. I'm the host of the Broadband Bunch, and today I get the pleasure of sharing my conversation with you all, with an interesting gentleman who has a ton of experience in this space and some pretty interesting perspectives. So, Guy, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Pete. Hello, everybody. Hope everybody is healthy and safe out there.
As do I.
Yeah, glad to be here, Pete.
Yeah, just some background on Guy, just so you understand where he's coming from. He is the founder of BevTech. It's a consultancy that advises software and service companies with a focus on digital transformation. Guy's got a tremendous experience, over 20 years at AT&T in various roles, leadership roles, managing major system integration and modernization efforts in both the BSS and OSS areas. He's bought a lot of software, so he's talked to a lot of folks on the vendor side, and he's been in the seats of a lot of you all that are on the service provider side, totaling over $2 billion in his career from software and services. And his experience transcends all areas, so billing, provisioning, servicing, and support. So it's a great opportunity to talk to Guy. He also has a lot of insight into mergers and acquisitions, which is a lot of activity that we see in this marketplace. He advises on organizational development, change management, and he's currently a professor, or teaching professor, I guess, at Loyola University. So, Guy, we're looking forward to digging into your experience and your brain, especially around this topic today, automation, which is a big word, and we'll dig into the different aspects that we see there around telecommunications.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it should be interesting. So I think some of the things that we should dig into, given before the last few months with COVID and the current crisis that we're in, there was a lot of challenges that service providers, telecom providers were dealing with before all that. Now you kind of layer on this other, I guess, circumstance, and some things are compressing, some things are moving around in terms of priorities, but it'd be really helpful to kind of level set and get your sense of what you see as the realities of what folks are dealing with today.
Yeah, without a doubt, Pete. Times are already challenging, right? And COVID-19 has made it that much more challenging. So again, our heart goes out to some of those that may be suffering as a result of COVID-19. But let's talk about some of those realities. I think it's a great place to start the conversation. And as you mentioned, Pete, spent over 20 years at AT&T. I've also consulted in smaller tiers. And I think I'd start with saying, regardless of the size of the organization, or in telecom, we talk about, still tier ones, tier two, tier threes. I'd say regardless of the size, realities are very common in my experience. And you mentioned something key at the beginning. You said part of the audience includes service providers, some may be product vendors. And I think for that part of the audience, understanding these realities from a perspective of what buyers, again, I was a buyer, I was a customer for many products and many services. I think it's important to level set on what those realities are. Without a doubt, I think it's fair to start with time, right? It's definitely a rare commodity, always has been. But here's the perspective. And again, thinking like a buyer, I often said, look, I don't even have time for this meeting, right? Yet alone start thinking about automation. So I think the element and the challenge of time continues to be an issue, not to be outdone by another shared challenge, and that is budgets or the financial side, right? And again, you will struggle to find a business, again, of any size that is not under budget pressures. Some would even say significant budget pressures. And why is this interesting to kind of contemplate? Because ultimately, cost cutting, right? Cutting costs impacts everyone in the ecosystem that provides services to carriers. And the cost cutting, goes hand in hand with the fact that there's a lot of price pressure in our industry, which leads to margin pressure. So in addition to time, we have buyers in the carrier space struggling with budget. And I also think there's a healthy level of skepticism. And in my consulting space, we often talk about this because it's something that one needs to reflect on. And there are various reasons to be skeptical, but some of the leading reasons is that there's an experience with past implementations that sometimes didn't provide the expected return or meet the promise. And then another level of skepticism is sometimes driven by, I could probably do this without automation. We're here to talk today about why that's probably not a good equation. Another reality is this concept that we call awareness, right? And this is, everyone already knows, right? There's a walking around set of knowledge that automation is likely better than a bunch of manual processes or one-offs. There's an awareness that manual processes lead to greater error rates. We'll come back to that, and time interval issues, and of course, customer dissatisfaction. So on top of all that, I would add one more reality, Pete, and that is the fact that everyone is doing more with less, right? People are overloaded. And this is important and actually an opportunity for service and product companies to help their clients, right? What I used to say is, listen, again, I've mentioned I'm pressed for time, but the last thing I can do is spend time trying to sell your product internally to the firm. It takes a lot of energy, but again, the point there being, it's an opportunity for service providers to actually help their customers, help their prospects. So those are some of the realities framing the discussion, Pete.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because I think one of the positives that come out of the situation that we're in now is that it's shifting, like you said, trying to get people off the fence, right? So intuitively, people know that you need to invest to save, right? But you can't always find the gaps within your operational cycles to do that, right? And currently, as people are coming out of this crisis, they're moving, trying to figure out how do we get through the crisis mode to long-term planning. It's hard to do both, right? And so we'll talk later on in terms of how to construct a more holistic story about how to sell that internally, right? But I think what we're coming off of are nice to have, some must to have, right? Because even from a consumer side, they know that they need better broadband and access, right? And from a provider side, they know that, wow, we need to be able to make sure that we can handle the capacity that we didn't expect. And it's not really going to change anywhere in the short term. So these are no longer theoretical. You need to get into tactically, how do we start addressing these things?
Yeah.
And I think that sets up something else too, because I think a lot of, because automation has occurred in telecom space for years, right? More on the internal system side. But I think you have a view that we'd love to share about one of the main shifts that you see in the carrier space from that internal to kind of an outside in.
Right. Yeah. I agree, Pete. There's actually one key shift, right, that I've experienced personally that is very relevant to today's discussion. And I talk about it in terms of moving from a billing-centric mode to a customer-centric mode. I mean, many years ago, we used to joke about the fact that the universe, centered around billing, in both the BSS and OSS space. And many of us who have been in this industry for some time can attest to the fact that often carriers, telecoms, started with billing systems, right? And then thought about the customer, more or less, as an add-on. I'm not here to say that, accurate and timely bills are not important. They continue to be, quite frankly, a leading complaint when you look at leading complaints for carriers. So it's still very important, but I am here to say, I'm talking about automation to win, that it should not be the starting dominant focus. And that's where this shift comes into play. And so if you think about it from, what's at the center of your business, and therefore, more tactically, what's at the center of your systems strategy, which would change your operational strategy, you really need to think about the customer and the customer data and the customer intelligence at the center of your ecosystem and everything you do. And an important point, of this whole customer is that we're not just talking about figuratively. Let's face it, most of us at most places that we do business with talk about we put the customer first. And I think companies mean that, right? But there's a difference in saying you put the customer first and what I'm talking about here. I am really talking about driving an architecture, a systems architecture that spans both, the business support systems and operational support systems in telecom, that really does put the customer data, customer intelligence in the center of everything else, right? And you build around that.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about some of the trends there, but I think some of the pressures that we get from non-traditional competitors entering the space and consumer expectations are driving some of the understandings that, hey, we need to figure out how to solve this problem. So I do want to walk through some of the trends that you've identified as really driving us in this direction.
Right. Again, just so think about what we've just stated, that there's this shift to a customer centric model. And really my point being that progressive leading companies have already started this shift. This is nothing new. And when you look at the trends, you start seeing how these winning strategies are really aligned at supporting that shift towards a customer-centric view, right? And so there are four that we're highlighting here. And just to level set, I'll explain a little bit about each, but more important, talk about how they become part of that customer-centric model. So I'd like to start with the omni-channel experience, right? And again, we have a big audience, and I think many people are familiar with omni-channel. But a simple way to think about omni-channel from a customer perspective, it's know me, right? Everywhere I do business with you, and treat me the same way, and have some level of continued experience. So what does that all mean? Whether I visit, if you have a brick and mortar store or office, whether I go to an online self-service channel, right, or deal with one of your reps, or call your call center, deal with you on the phone, omni-channel is really about having a consistent experience, right? How many of us have to repeat ourselves as we get handed off, right? Making it continuous and the seamless experience, right? Where it's without fallout. So omni-channel has been a trend, and it will continue to be one for customer-focused companies. The second one we talk about here is digital transformation. I'll be the first to raise my hand, Pete, and say another one of the overused phrases, right, amongst many, right?
Yeah.
But so specifically, I'm talking about having an intentional, true digital strategy focused on self-service. Nothing else, self-service. An online where I can order, I can enter trouble, I can see status, everything cradle to grave online, right? It's a choice. as a customer, I may choose to do business with you online or decide to call you. It gives me great flexibility, right, to decide which way I want to go. And quite frankly, it provides availability, right? It's always on, right? If done right. If done right, it's always on. So although, as I stated, an overused phrase, it's an important trend that winning companies are pursuing. And I think just a quick related point to that, I often think about the why here, right? And the first thing in terms of understanding the why is because customers want it, and I've even experienced customers demanding it, right? Being part of an RFP that it's a non-starter if you don't have it. So customers want it, and then the other point that we'll explore a bit further later, it really becomes a competitive disadvantage not having a true digital strategy and digital framework. The third one that we talk about is personalization. Now, you know, years ago when we talked about this in the automation space, people weren't as familiar with it as they are now because many of us, you know, we're online shoppers, right? And we understand what it means to have an offer personalized to your liking, right? Product offers are personalized. That's part of it. What I'm also stating, and this is probably a more emerging trend, is personalized experiences. Yeah, Pete, you and I, you know, we'd like to navigate online shopping and maybe even brick and mortar differently, right? So why not customize those experiences for us? That's a trend. And the last one, a lot of talk about data, right? I talk about it in terms of data insight. Now, some people fairly, you know, talk about it in terms of business intelligence, which I think is very okay in terms of this space. But I think talking about it in terms of data insight actually gets at the heart of the value proposition. And specifically, there are two areas with data insight that I think are important: data correlation, right, and predictive analytics. So real quick with data correlation, here we're talking about collecting the data. And by the way, we're talking both structured and unstructured data for those technical folks that we have on the call, right? Complex, non-complex. But more important, the ability to synthesize those different data types and actually be able to conclude some insights, okay? That's more the data correlation. The predictive analytics, I kind of think about as related, but yet a little different, because I think there is where the algorithms come into play, okay? Where the algorithms are using that data that you've synthesized to predict. And in our space, I mean, we're familiar with some of the tools that are out there, right? Predicting network events. You know, you're going to have a spike, you may have an outage, or related to the customer-centric, predicting customer habits, and maybe predicting and helping me deduce how to solve a problem. In fact, that last area that I just mentioned, Gartner with some partners termed a new space that they refer to as AI ops, which is more associated with helping you resolve problems proactively. So these are trends, again, Pete, to wrap it up, that I think progressive, customer-centric carriers have been focused on for some years now already.
Yeah, and it's something that I want to, because there's a mouthful here, right? There's a lot going on, and you don't have to take a bite all at once. But some of the things I think we can look across the different industries and see that a lot of this occurred in the financial services or the insurance areas already, right? And my fear is that folks will look at this and say, hey, this is a tier one play, right? I don't have the budget or the resources to do this, but I think that's inaccurate, because I think that there are platforms and tools and capabilities out of it that are off the shelf that can really help smaller players, like you said. If it's a competitive disadvantage not to have these, the converse is true, right? That these are competitive weapons, that if you can take strides in these areas to be able to figure out what your data is telling you, how to offer more of a personalized one-to-one experience, right? That helps you transform everything else around it. and helps you stay, a way to stay traceable across platforms to help that buyer make the choices and have the freedom to make those choices that best suit them. And I think it's addressable regardless of the tier at different levels. But I don't want people to think, oh, okay, this is for Comcast or Verizon, whatever. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I agree entirely. In fact, with not to get down a rabbit hole here, but with the as a service, to your point, opportunity, right? It also becomes much more affordable, Pete, right?
Yeah, and so kind of broke it down a little bit to help people understand what's available today from a tool set perspective, right? To help them with the technology. And if you could help us just understand, where you see the value of these pieces to help move towards this vision, great.
Right. Yeah, because it kind of moves you a little bit to the, how do you go about this? And that's really what this slide is intended to share. Here's the way to think about this before I just go a little deeper on each. I'm talking about shaping a technical strategy and your ecosystem, the component parts that are important to do some of the things that winning companies are doing, right? Because let's face it, when you get into the technology stack and technical architecture, there is a level of sophistication and advanced capabilities, some other time we could spend on it. But I'm trying to share here, if you're building a roadmap, what are the important components that need to be considered, right? Makes sense? Yeah. So I like to start with the data layer, the data model. I think it's foundational, quite frankly, to all the other layers, and that's why I start there, right? And of course here, again, for the technical folks, you definitely need to pass the scalability, the availability, the asset test, the full asset test of database. I'm talking past that. I'm talking about a data model that has the right content, rich in content, to support that customer experience that we talked about, and that's integrated across your application architecture, right? That it can be shared to support that consistency that we talked about that's so important. So a rich integrated data model is core to this overall, it's a core foundational element. The second one is ensuring that your technology architecture and ecosystem has considered modularity. Now, I will tell you, this sometimes gets very confused and can get very technical. I want to explain in layperson terms what I'm talking about here. I'm really talking about reuse, right? Reuse, the ability to leverage components that you need, and quite frankly, to be more of a use to support your growth, right? Build as you grow. And for the more technical folks, here's where I'm talking about where you would contemplate, the API strategy, hopefully RESTful APIs. This is where you would contemplate the services-oriented architecture strategy, or more modern, here's where you would contemplate where microservices, small, contained, reusable code fits in. An easy example, maybe from a business perspective is, think about our space. Check eligibility is always a step, no matter what people are buying, and no matter business or consumer. It is amazing how many companies have recoded the logic to check eligibility of a customer many times, instead of just adopting some of those technologies that I mentioned, right? Thought about in advance. So the modular approach is key. Responsive is another one, maybe better called adaptive and responsive. So for the responsive web design folks here, I am talking about the concept of coding once and using across multiple devices. I mentioned digital strategy is key, and to Pete's point, at all sides of the spectrum, right? So here what you want to do is you want to adapt frameworks, right, that allow you to have what a lot of people refer to as optimized form factors. What does that all mean? That means that whether I'm using my small screen mobile phone or my tablet, like I happen to be using for this session, or my desktop, right? Did I code it once and use the software technologies that are available, that are out there, to actually render a screen and an experience, right, that supports the flow that the customers expect? But build once, use many. The other space, these are all very related, but again, another key component, digital user experience. Many people are familiar with this. I think it's fair to say that this could be more design based than technology based, which is fine, but there are technologies to support this. Again, to put it into context, we're talking about moving to a customer-centric model. The whole point of digital user experience is to focus on simple, elegant flows if you're talking online, or any experience with the customers. So this brings into play what the DUX gurus call design-based thinking, or said another way, the customer, right, should not be an afterthought. And that's why they've adopted this concept of customer empathy. So when you're building the architecture, right, and you're building the tools, you're actually thinking about how the customer will experience you, right, at the onset. And then the last component part, which I think, again, is key of this entire ecosystem, is you really have to think about the tooling, the engineering tooling. And here's why, because that's a mouthful. I am specifically here talking about the concept usually referred to as continuous delivery or continuous integration. In all fairness, sometimes people talk about it in terms of DevOps, and we could probably have a 2-hour discussion with 10 different definitions on what DevOps is, right? But again, in business terms, this supports an environment where you can make software changes in your ecosystems quickly and dynamically, and be able to drop in changes on the fly. That's the business value, right? And it really, in many cases, requires some retooling because some tools have already been invested. So really the point I'm making here across these areas is build that roadmap and then pick the actual software components to drop in, if you will, after. I have personally seen multiple times where it's done the other way around. You buy a bunch of tools and then you're trying to piece them together, right? So when you're looking at the data model, eventually you'll have the discussion of relational or NoSQL. If you go NoSQL, you have a discussion of, am I going to use MongoDB, MariaDB, some other open source? When you talk about, say responsive, you're going to start looking at the frameworks, Angular, Backbone, Twitter, Bootstraps. The truth is they do very similar things. Tooling, you start looking at things like, a lot of available software in this space for continuous integration, right? Some interesting names, Chef, Puppet, Jenkins, Kubernetes. I think that's key. I'm not trying to minimize it. But what I'm saying is if you have that roadmap developed in advance, filling in the pieces, Pete, becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, and I think you don't have to do it alone, right? There's also, again, a lot in this slide, baked in the slide, but there's a lot of industry efforts out there and cross-industry efforts that really can help us. The TM forum, where you're going to somebody who knows how to speak your business, right? You don't need to reinvent it from wheel. And there's some really big players, Microsoft. We're helping out to take the TM forum methodologies and customize databases so that there's a database that's available to telecom providers. And modularity, there's a lot of action going on with software-defined networking. So there's some big trends that are happening that are helpful to either open source or industry-driven efforts to jumpstart these efforts. So I invite you all to take a look at those, and we have some resources if you're interested in learning more about that. So we talked about this massive shift from billing to customer-centric. We talked about some of the trends that are driving that, omnichannel and personalization, and then you gave us a great glimpse of a lot of technology, also technology trends, I guess, that are helping to support those moves. But we still need to get to the why, right? People know they need to invest to save, right? They're in the middle of a crisis. They're trying to they're bootstrapped or they're overstrapped to try to solve today's problem. So how do we tell that story better to get organizations on board? You've led big purchases in your past life. What are the things that resonated with you? What's some of the advice that you would provide to folks that are trying to champion these efforts within their organizations?
Yeah, I definitely still have a lot of scar tissue, Pete. You've heard me say that before from some of those past experiences, and I'm sure a lot of the engineers on the call can attest to having the same. I think to your question about, understanding why you need to automate, I think makes the discussion more business focused than so much a technical focused discussion. And again, this is not earth shattering by any means, but I do have a couple perspectives. And if you look at, historically, the focus on automation, and that's been true, by the way, in all industries, but definitely true in telecom, I think many will find that operational effectiveness and operational efficiency have been key drivers for focusing automation, right? By the way, still very important today, but you'll see my point being likely not enough. So, as an example, if you're talking about ordering a complex data circuit, virtual private network, very complex flow, right? Cradle to grave, ordering through provisioning, activation, and then eventually servicing. Very complicated. Doing it manually or semi-manually with a lot of handoffs, right, leads to that greater error rate that we talked about earlier, and unfortunately long interval cycles, and unfortunately higher cost. So focusing the whys on operational effectiveness and efficiency, remember we talked about the cost pressures, still very real, right? On top of that, not instead of, in addition to, is the quality of service side. And those of us in this industry, I'm proud of this, but how many times have we ordered one thing and the bill said another, right? It's complicated, right? So whether it's that experience or something else, when you think about automation reasons, going back to the why, often there's been a thrust focused on quality, right? How do we get it right? How do we get it right? So quality, in addition to operational efficiency and effectiveness, still remains very real. On top of that, I talk about scale. Now, I'm not talking about, again, for the engineering, how do I pick scalable products? Of course you need to do so. But I'm talking about business use cases to support the growth of a business, right? I'm talking about being able to automate so the business can grow. Unfortunately, truth be told, there are some companies that can only handle so much volume, right? Can only handle so much volume and know their maximum growth potential. What I'm sharing is that winning companies have targeted investment dollars, Pete, to the business case on removing that upper bound, right? So you continue to scale and grow the business, focusing automation dollars there. At the top of the heap, if you will, we have competitive advantage. A lot of discussions on competitive advantage. I have an opinion here that carriers today, they're not going to invest in competitive advantage as a Boolean, yes, no, I'm going to do it, I'm not going to do it. I think you're going to do it. It's a matter of what triggers you, right? So progressive companies are proactively, automating as a driving force, as a competitive advantage. And they also realize that the time span of that competitive advantage is short and keeps getting shorter, which means if you're going to automate for a competitive advantage, you have to build a culture, right? And there's investments where you continuously integrate, to my earlier point on continuous integration, and bring in the next idea to remain ahead of the pack. But I stated that if you don't do it proactively, you will do it reactively, more for competitive survival, right? To remain relevant, right? And don't forget, many customers are asking for it, right? Many customers are asking to be able to integrate some of their systems with carrier systems. So I still think very true today, and there's another final point I'll make on this slide that maybe doesn't jump out at you, but if you think about operational efficiency, I mentioned very targeted, not only, but mainly on cost optimization, right? So there you have a cost focus. Quality of service, if you really focus on when an investment's made on automation for quality, ultimately it's kind of related to retention, right? Revenue protection. But when you start looking at revenue growth, okay, you really are focused on how do you ensure you can scale this business, and how do you ensure you keep investing in competitive advantage to gain more market share. Those top two layers are definitely more revenue growth oriented than the others, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thanks for walking us through that. And I think, to kind of put you on your toes a little bit, you mentioned the customer-centric view, right? And so it'd be interesting to reformulate this chart with the customer in mind, right? Because I think, the operational efficiencies are often perceived as a profit play, but it's more of being able to offer the same services more affordably, right? And the quality of service, again, is making sure that the viewer or your subscribers or your customers are getting what they are paying for, A, right? And B, that you're exceeding their expectations in terms of what you're committing to, right? A lot of folks experienced that in this recent COVID situation where they thought they were getting certain bandwidth, and then once everybody's overloaded on that network, didn't quite meet the quality of service expectations. And then scale, to me, it's really not just adding new customers, but it's being able to roll out new services faster, right? So making your existing customers more happy, which is a clear competitive advantage. So maybe you can redraw this in the future.
Makes sense, Pete.
So, nobody's going to dispute that we need to invest in whether you're trying to do things better, faster, cheaper, or trying to grow and protect and retain your clients or make them happy. But sometimes that story doesn't always get through, right? And so what would you like in your experience to, how would you like vendors or internal folks to present their story to you to help you say yes or no, make better decisions faster?
Yeah. In terms of, supporting the benefits, I think you have to think about it from a terms of what's the return on the investment. Couple points I want to make here. Again, the investments have to make sense. We talked about budget constraints. I have yet to meet a business that has unlimited resources. Okay, so when I think about the ROI, I start with how do you show that it makes business sense? And for all my peers that are service providers, consulting providers, and product providers, I think there's an opportunity here to help your customers, because the 2 points I want to make are related to justification and prioritization, right? And justification, again, intuitively, people kind of know it makes sense. But, my experience is, unless you're personally funding it, intuitively, you don't always get the money. And sometimes investments get stalled because of the business case. So Pete, from my experience, help with the justification is critical, because again, people are overloaded. They don't want to have to, they just don't have the time to invest to resell it internally. And I'm a big believer in, you have to justify and do your homework, whether you're a, more sophisticated shop that you need to see the internal rate of return plus the net present value plus the payback value, or maybe more informal with just the, benefits against expenses. Regardless, the homework needs to be done. The question becomes, how do you justify it? And I'm just going to share 2 points that I've advised on that I think are often overlooked on business cases that can be used quickly. churn reduction and opportunity cost, okay? Churn reduction, we understand it in our industry. Loss of customers has a real cost, right? So how do you build a business case that's focused on reducing churn, eliminating churn, or at least that being the ideal goal, right? You first have to understand and measure, most do, what the churn rate is, and then be able to associate a cost, because there's a real cost, right, to churn. And the point being that if you can eliminate, usually through some automation, some of those flow through ordering issues, there's a great deal of benefit to be had by eliminating that cost. So that's the churn reduction. The second area, Pete and everyone, has to do, I mentioned, with opportunity cost. And again, with the absence of automation, sometimes the opportunity is not known. And specifically, here's what you can measure. Reworking fallout issues, reworking order issues. There's a cost because you don't have the opportunity to sell new customers. Again, we only have so many resources. If I'm spending time on fixing something I already sold, it's taking away time from selling something else or upselling. Quantifying that opportunity cost and putting it in your business case, those two things, churn and opportunity, help with the justification. Now, prioritization, which, we have this little visual here on this slide that's really focused more on the prioritization. And the point being, it's like, where do you start? There's so many ideas and there's so many things we want to do, right? And we laid this roadmap that we talked about. And sometimes thinking about it this way helps you decide what you do first, right? What's going to have the biggest bang. And volumes, I think, is an important variable, and understanding your automation maturity of your current shop is also part of this model. And what does that mean? The higher the volumes and the more sophisticated the automation and more integrated, the higher the payback. Because you can automate, right, and get to a high automation, right, and not really reach the significant levels if your volumes are low. So it kind of brings in that common sense, right? I mean, where do we go, right? And where do I put my dollars? Think about it this way. Going back to the earlier point, if you look at KPIs, right, key performance indicators of winning telcos, I mean, again, maybe tier one example here, but whether you pick up a Verizon or a Comcast you mentioned, or T-Mobile, they look at churn. It's in annual reports, right? It's in board meetings of private companies. Why? Because it costs real business. So when it comes time to prioritize, I'm saying understand the volumes, understand those issues, but also understand where you are in the automation maturity. People usually ask me, what does that mean? What's low? Well, low to me in application maturity would be, spreadsheets, one-off databases, maybe a point solution here, maybe a point solution there, a lot of swivel chair, right? I'm swiveling in my chair if you can't see it, Pete. A lot of swivel chair. By the way, all tiers have that, right? But they start moving to the right, where the right being an understanding based on some of the things that we've talked about so far on this call.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. I think mapping back to those key economic drivers is important, and it's pretty, I think folks can do it rather easily if they sat down and kind of work through it. The one thing that's really frustrating, and that's why we have the quote here from Mr. Ford about without orchestrating this information, the responsible, if you have these initiatives and you're responsible for getting the funding and support needed, a lot of times, we always say, like, a confused mind doesn't make a decision or does nothing, right? And that's a lot of cases that we see, is that folks have great ideas on how to get better and how to innovate, but being able to construct a clear story connected to these core business drivers, you got to muscle through it and figure out how to tell that story, because if you're not doing anything, then eventually you're going to pay for it anyway.
Agree. Yep, I agree.
Yeah, so we've said a lot, and how do people get started, right? And this is, like we said, there's ton of ideas. We're short-handed. We're dealing with crisis modes. We have all this technology lingo to learn, and we're just still trying to do our jobs, less everybody else's job.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
starting next week, what can we all do?
Yeah. You know, there's no escaping doing your homework, as we used to say. So I think starting with an assessment of understanding your present mode of operation, and quite frankly, it doesn't have to be daunting, but understanding, for example, where are we? An honest discussion on that automation maturity curve. What are our volumes? What is our churn rate, right? What have we done? If you believe in those trends, they're very real trends. And if you correlate winning companies adopting those, you know, where are you against those trends? So I think that assessment is the starting point next week, Pete. The second thing really has to do, and this is not, you know, sequential order necessarily, but I think early on, understanding true customer needs is pivotal. And we used to talk about this in terms of, you know, let's not pretend that we, know, let's truly ask. Again, it doesn't have to be overly sophisticated, right? A conversation, you know, focus group, call it what you will. But it was amazing when we asked the customers what they needed and what they wanted, how revealing it was, right? The overlap between what we thought and what they said sometimes wasn't as big as we had hoped, right?
Right.
So
Right.
understanding those needs and wants, Pete, I think is key. Then, of course, developing those roadmaps, some of them that we talked about here, to get you towards that end state. And keeping in mind that that roadmap of where you need to go needs to take into consideration the building block approach. Nobody wants a redo. Nobody wants a redo. That's why I started with these are core components, right? So you can piecemeal it along the way and not have to reinvent things. So once you have that roadmap, you know, we talked about the business case. And again, it doesn't have to be daunting either. I actually focused on tried and true, if you will, variables that I use in business cases in telco, not, you know, at different tiers. They work, right? If I were a CFO or responsible for the purse or an owner of a company, I need to see the due diligence. I need to see the return on investment. So you got to do the business case. Use your vendor partners, if you're a carrier, to help you do that. Don't be afraid to ask. If you're a vendor on this call, don't be afraid to offer, right? It's an easy thing. They're overwhelmed. And then, you know, keep in mind this incremental approach. It does incremental, again, just repeating a slight point, doesn't happen, you know, by chance. You need some of that tooling to support incremental growth, right? And then incremental build. And then the last thing, you know, one, you know, people often say, oh my gosh, is it too late? If you missed that train, what are we really saying here? No, I don't even think it's too late. Quite frankly, if you're not burdened, especially to the tier 3 people on the call, if you're not burdened by the legacy systems of maybe some much larger companies, you have an advantage. Nothing to unplug, right? But what I would say to anyone at any level is don't wait. You know, it's not like the competition is standing still. You know, get started. There is a way to take, you know, you said this is kind of a lot to chew on, right? It's a mouthful, but there is a way, there is an approach to make this very doable.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think there's a question here that's popped up about, you know, folks are obviously in the various stages of this kind of transformation and investment decision making. You mentioned a little bit about how to partner with your vendors, right? So any other thoughts on how to help people assess vendor solutions, you know, if they're in an RFP process?
Oh, yeah. This close to my heart. I would say if you're using the old school RFP process where you got all the capabilities and you're trying to score on a bunch of vendors, send their responses, my advice would be to ditch it. Because what happens, a lot of time is spent, you get all these answers and it's hard to differentiate A from B from C. It's very real. Basic capabilities are addressed. I'm a big fan of the proof of concept, right? Mm-hmm. But not just, hey, here's a concept, go prove it. I'm a big fan of a relationship, a partnership. We did it, right? Where, you create your short list, right? There's a way to do that, but definitely look at the, 80% capabilities are usually met by just a few features. Any vendor who wants your business is going to agree to partner with you. You have to invest some time. I used to put my best engineers with their best engineers. Here's what I want to accomplish within a week or two, instead of 2 or 3 months. Prove that I can do this. And I will tell you, it expedited decision making. It made it a lot easier, by the way, for folks who have to sign off on the check too, right? When
Yeah.
you can show them.
What about transparency? I mean, what is the right level of transparency to expect, or how do you garner a transparent relationship with partners and vendors to help just to help understand where they're coming from and to build a healthy partnership, right? Nobody wants to put anybody over a barrel or put somebody out of business if it's truly a partnership or relationship. Any thoughts and suggestions there?
Yeah, you're talking transparency between, say, a carrier and a vendor specifically. Yeah. I mean, obviously, super important, but Pete, I would say both ways, right? Both ways. For the vendor partners, excuse the expression, but it's to say, just don't waste my time. You know what I'm looking for. Don't try to create another problem. If it can't meet the need, then we both need to move on. So being transparent on what exists and what doesn't, believe it or not, just that level of trust and transparency, even if there was a gap, Pete, sometimes I gave a lot of weight to. I've put up a lot of systems. I know that stuff doesn't always go according to plan. And I love to be in a partner relationship with someone I can trust and showing me that transparency up front. It's hard to score in an RFP, but I was one of the decision makers, and that's more of a soft variable, if you will. To the carriers, I think do your due diligence. If you have to sign a non-disclosure, do so. But in my space, showing the skeletons was key, right? Sharing the opportunity, and considering even maybe some creative deals, right? Being transparent about that, maybe success sharing type deals, but making sure that don't let the vendors guess. I mean, they spend a lot of time trying to figure out how they can help you too, and maybe there's just 2 of the 50 things that they have that's really all you need. Let them know openly, your real problems.
Right. And what do you think about the impact of COVID, on the supply chain, right? I mean, so we're all kind of just coming out of, or at least it feels like we're just coming out of kind of this hesitation to move forward. And I know specifically in our industry, things have been crazy busy. So I'm assuming it's not so bad, but money's starting to flow into this marketplace. The demand from consumers is starting to peak, and it probably will get worse. You see any issues with supply chain in terms of everybody rushing to solve these problems, and how do you think that would affect how we approach?
Yeah. I think I'm answering the question. Tell me if I'm not, but there is going to be an impact because of COVID-19 that flows to everyone providing value in the supply chain, because, and this is public information, carriers already starting to state some revised guidance, right? Private companies are already starting to worry about, some of the pullback in spend from their customers that they're seeing. Obviously, a pullback in spend makes the investment in automation that much more challenging.
Right.
So there's going to be an impact. But Pete, I do think there's going to be, in my opinion, a demand growth curve that's going to come at us pretty hard. It may not happen in the next quarter or two, but I don't see it as remaining stagnant for too far out there. And it's going to vary depending on the carriers. But ultimately, those who need to invest for that competitive advantage are already thinking and have plans in place, right? Aligning the right vendors for when the gate opens, if you will. So and by the way, Pete, you know, your question made me think about it. It's a great opportunity to start doing some of this work that we talked about here. You know, the assessment, you know, building the roadmap, you know, you're changing the engine on the plane while it was flying is how we felt about things often, you know, in my days at AT&T, right? Because the business wasn't standing still. And not that it's standing still now, but nobody likes a reduced pipeline by any means or activity. But if that is the case in anybody's space, it may give people a little bit additional bandwidth to actually do some of the things that we talked about here in terms of getting started.
And you know, on a related point, I mean, we didn't really mention, we talked about operational efficiency, but also safety, right? I mean, so a lot of automation is going to come from reducing, doing remote customer calls or device updates or field service calls. I mean, so there's a lot of good AI and our, you know, automated RPA solutions that are helping folks, or VR or whatever. A lot of interesting things that are going to be pushed to the forefront because some industries have already figured out, hey, I can't send a rep out there because it's, you know, that's just not safe. You know, so I think that should be an interesting element to this ROI case.
Yeah, that's a good point. And definitely it could even be a challenge related to those proofs of concepts that I talked about. It could be a whole other discussion, but on our experience, having people side by side in a collaborative environment definitely was easier and made things move a little bit faster, but it can definitely be done virtually. We've done the same, but it'll introduce another variable that needs to be overcome.
Yeah, and just, you know, I appreciate the conversation, and we're at our limit, so we got to let people get back to all the work that you just gave them to do. So appreciate all that insight there. The slides are available. They have your email, so I welcome them to reach out to me or to yourself. Also invite them to take a look at this white paper that we put together around automation and fulfillment. I think it's a good breakdown of the approach that Guy had laid out about mapping back to an ROI case and ways to find ways to better serve your customers. So thank you for joining us, and give it back to Doug.
Thanks everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy, and thank you, Pete, for presenting this afternoon. And thank you to everyone who joined us. The recording will be available on FBA's website within 24 hours. If you have any questions regarding the Fiber Broadband Association, please email membership@fiberbroadband.org. Again, thank you to our panelists and everyone for joining. This concludes the presentation.
Great. Take care, everybody.